December 1945, somewhere in West Texas, the mess hall door swung open, and the room held its breath. A line of gaunt women stepped inside, their torn uniforms hanging loose on frames made of hunger and fear. Outside, the desert wind kicked dust against the wooden walls. Inside, steam rose from tin bowls filled with beef stew. American cowboys turned guard stood aside, their weathered faces unreadable beneath wide-brimmed hats. One of them, an older rancher with sun-carved wrinkles, nodded toward the trembling Japanese prisoners. "They eat first tonight," he said quietly. "Not as charity, as fact." The women froze. Behind them, armed soldiers stepped back from the serving line. This wasn't how enemies were supposed to behave. This wasn't what they'd been promised. Before we continue, if this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. These forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us share more untold stories from history. Now, let's return to that mess hall in Texas, where everything these women believed about their enemy was about to shatter. Kyoko stood third in line, her legs threatening to buckle. The scent of cooked meat, real meat, made her stomach cramp with longing and guilt in equal measure. She'd been 14 when she joined the Women's Auxiliary, scrubbing blood from hospital floors while officers barked warnings about American savagery. They would be tortured if captured, used, destroyed. Death was preferable to surrender. And yet here she was, alive, holding an empty tray, while a cowboy with calloused hands ladled stew into her bowl. He didn't spit, didn't sneer, just served the food and moved to the next woman. Behind him, a dozen American guards waited their turn, actually waited. Kyoko's hands shook as she carried her tray to a wooden bench. The stew's heat seeped through the metal, warming her palms. She stared at it, paralyzed by contradiction. That first spoonful hit her tongue like fire salt, pepper, beef fat, flavors she'd almost forgotten existed. Her body shuddered involuntarily. Around her, other women began to eat, some weeping silently into their bowls, others laughing with the brittle edge of disbelief. One young girl, barely 16, ate so fast she choked, then ate more, unable to stop herself. And in that moment, staring at the half-empty bowl in her trembling hands, Kyoko realized something terrifying. Everything she'd been taught might be a lie. To understand that December evening in 1945, you have to go back to the spring of 1945, when the war in the Pacific was entering its final brutal phase. By then, Japan had mobilized not just soldiers, but civilians, women, children, anyone who could hold a rifle or tie a tourniquet. The Women's Volunteer Labor Corps numbered over 2 million, trained to expect death before dishonor, extinction before surrender. They were taught that Americans were devils incarnate. Propaganda films showed barbaric GIs torturing prisoners. Radio broadcasts described rape camps and execution squads. Teachers in schools made students practice group suicide drills. The message was clear and constant. Capture meant a fate worse than death. Better to die with a grenade in your hands than live as an American prisoner. Kyoko had believed it all. Why wouldn't she? The firebombing of Tokyo had killed 100,000 civilians in a single night. American planes turned entire cities into ash. When you've watched the sky rain fire, it's easy to believe the enemy is inhuman. When you've held the hand of a dying soldier who whispered his mother's name. It's easy to hate the men who put him there. But then came August 15th, 1945, the Emperor's voice crackling over radio speakers saying the unthinkable. Japan would surrender. Officers wept openly. Some committed suicide rather than face the shame. The women of the auxiliaries sat in stunned silence, waiting for American forces to arrive and confirm their worst fears. Instead, they were loaded onto trucks, then ships, then more trucks. No executions, no torture chambers. Just long, confused journeys across an ocean to a country most of them had only seen in propaganda posters. The ships that carried them had bunks with mattresses, not comfortable, but clean. The food was plain, but regular. Guards spoke little, their expressions more tired than cruel. It made no sense. Every kindness felt like the setup for a greater betrayal. Kyoko spent those weeks on the ship waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the masks to come off, for the Americans to reveal their true nature. But the revelation never came, only more inexplicable decency. By the time the transport trucks rolled through the gates of a makeshift POW camp in West Texas, the women were more confused than terrified. The camp wasn't behind barbed wire and guard towers. It was a converted ranch, all wooden barracks and open sky. Cowboys, not soldiers, waited to receive them. Men who'd been ranching cattle a year ago, now tasked with guarding enemy prisoners because every able-bodied soldier was overseas. They stepped off the truck into furnace heat and impossible space. Texas stretched in every direction, flat and huge and utterly foreign. The guards, these rough men in work boots and stained hats, looked at them not with hatred, but with something harder to name. Pity, maybe. Discomfort. One older cowboy removed his hat when the women passed, as if attending a funeral. That first night, the foreman made his announcement. They eat first, tonight. It wasn't policy. It wasn't orders from headquarters. It was the decision of men who'd grown up being taught that you feed guests before yourself, that women and children go first, that there are rules about decency that transcend war. For the women, it was incomprehensible. In their world, hierarchy was absolute. Soldiers ate before civilians, men before women, victors before vanquished. The idea that enemy prisoners would be served before their captors violated every principle they'd been raised with. Some refused to eat at first, convinced the food was poisoned or a prelude to worse treatment. But hunger is a powerful persuader, and eventually they all ate. The stew was simple beef, potatoes, onions in a thick broth, but to women who'd been surviving on weeds and bark, it was incomprehensible luxury. The bread was white, soft, still warm. The coffee was real coffee, not roasted grain or chicory substitute. And the portions weren't survival rations. They were generous. That night, lying on a cot with a blanket that smelled of soap instead of sweat, Kyoko stared at the ceiling and felt the first cracks forming in her certainty. If the enemy feeds you before themselves, if they give you beds and blankets and hot food, then what does that make them? And what does that make you? The days that followed established a rhythm that felt more disorienting than captivity. They were woken not by shouts, but by a bell. Breakfast was waiting: eggs, bacon, toast. The bacon made several women cry. Its smell alone carried memories of a life before war, before rationing, before everything became about survival. After breakfast, the guards distributed work assignments. Not forced labor, but simple maintenance, sweeping the barracks, feeding chickens, tending a small vegetable garden. One cowboy handed Kyoko a broom and gestured toward the porch steps. She took it hesitantly, waiting for the trick, the trap. He just nodded and walked away. The work was easy, almost therapeutic. The chickens clucked and pecked without knowing or caring about the war. The garden needed weeding. The porch needed sweeping. Simple tasks that had clear beginnings and endings, unlike the endless uncertainty of everything else. Some of the women found comfort in the routine. Others felt guilty for every moment that didn't hurt. The guards rarely spoke to them directly, limited by language and awkwardness, but they communicated through gestures and expressions. A nod when work was done well, a offered canteen on a hot afternoon, a young cowboy teaching one of the girls how to collect eggs without startling the hens. Small kindnesses that accumulated like snowfall. The wash house became a place of transformation. The first time the guards led them there, the women balked at the entrance, certain it was a trap. Inside were basins of hot water, bars of soap that smelled like flowers, towels that were rough but clean. The guards stepped outside and closed the door. Privacy. Actual privacy. Kyoko's hands shook as she lifted the soap. It was white and smooth, heavier than she expected. When she dipped it in the water and brought it to her face, the lather was soft and slick. She scrubbed months of grime away and felt something inside her crack open. Around her, other women wept or laughed or simply stood under the water, letting it run over their heads and down their backs. One woman whispered prayers in Japanese. Another hummed a lullaby. Outside, the cowboys heard the sounds laughter, mixed with crying, voices rising and falling. One guard shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. Another said quietly, "They ain't what I expected." The first nodded. "Me neither." When the women emerged, hair damp and skin flushed, they looked different. Not just cleaner, but more present. Their eyes held less fear and more confusion, which somehow felt like progress. One cowboy tipped his hat as they passed. A few of the women nodded back. It was the beginning of something, though no one could say what. That evening someone produced a harmonica. The sound drifted across the yard's slow, wavering notes that spoke of loneliness and open spaces. Yumi, one of the youngest prisoners, stood transfixed. The guard playing it noticed her attention and beckoned her over. He showed her how to hold it, how to blow gently. Her first attempt produced a horrible squawk. He laughed, not mockingly but warmly, and she laughed too, surprised by the sound of her own amusement. Inside, another guard unpacked a deck of cards. He dealt them out on a wooden table and gestured for anyone interested. The women approached cautiously. He pointed to each card, Jack, Queen, King, Ace, mangling the Japanese words he tried to learn. They corrected him gently. He butchered the words again, intentionally this time, and earned real smiles. The game had no stakes, just the simple pleasure of play. When someone won a hand, there were groans and laughter. When someone lost, there was theatrical dismay. For 30 minutes, war didn't exist. There were just people around a table, fumbling through language barriers and finding connection in the universal grammar of games. But joy never lasted long before guilt arrived. Kyoko watched Yumi smile at the harmonica player and felt her stomach twist. How could they laugh here? How could they find comfort in the enemy's camp while their families starved in Japan? Every moment of ease felt like betrayal, every kindness like collaboration. That night, lying awake, she heard Yumi crying softly in the next bunk. "What's wrong?" Kyoko whispered. Yumi's voice was small in the darkness. "I forgot to hate them today. Just for a little while, and now I hate myself." Kyoko had no answer. Because she understood, the letters changed everything. One morning, a guard brought paper and pencils to the mess hall. His words were simple. "You can write home." No one moved. Writing home was for victors, not prisoners, not women who had surrendered. At last a pencil lifted, then another, then Kyoko's. She stared at the page, unsure what truth wouldn't sound like betrayal. Finally she wrote, "Mother, I am alive." She added that they were fed, given blankets, allowed to sleep. The guards did not hurt them. Sometimes there was music. "I don't understand any of this," she wrote, "but I am alive." Others wrote the same short, stunned sentences. The letters were gathered and sent. Some reached Japan. Those that arrived shattered homes built on certainty. Parents wept. Neighbors whispered. Military censors read in silence. These letters were dangerous. They spoke of stew and soap, not brutality, and threatened the story the war depended on. In Texas, replies rarely came. Still, writing changed the women. It made them visible again. One night, a fire burned outside the barracks. The women gathered. No orders, no threats. Yumi asked softly why the guards fed them first. Noriko answered, "Because they're not what we were told." Kyoko watched the flames. If the enemy wasn't monstrous, then what was the war? As sparks rose into the dark sky, old beliefs burned with them. Kyoko realized certainty, not captivity, notice. She wrapped her blanket tighter and allowed the most dangerous thought of all. Maybe we were wrong about everything. They gathered at dawn. Belongings bundled in cloth or tied with string. The sky was still dark, stars fading into the pale promise of sunrise. The women moved quietly, years of military discipline making them efficient even now. But this wasn't marching orders. This was departure. The trucks idled in the yard, engines rumbling low. The same vehicles that had brought them here months ago, gaunt and terrified, now waited to carry them forward. Not the same women who'd arrived. They'd gained weight. Their cheeks had color. The cuts on their feet had healed. But deeper things had mended too, things that couldn't be measured. Kyoko clutched her last letter to her mother, still unposted, folded in her pocket like a talisman. Yumi held the harmonica wrapped in cloth, a gift from a guard who'd waved away her attempts to return it. As they climbed into the truck beds, the cowboys gathered in an informal line. Thomas, the one with the limp who'd taught Yumi to play, approached her as she stepped up. He didn't say much words, had never been his strength. Just pointed to her pocket and said, "Play it back home. Remember us kindly." Her eyes shone with tears she didn't let fall. She nodded once, firmly, and took her seat. The other women arranged themselves on benches that someone had cushioned with old tarps. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd expected. More than they'd been promised. The engine roared. Gravel shifted. And then something happened that none of them had anticipated. As the truck began to roll, every cowboy removed his hat. Not in mockery or ceremony, but in simple respect. A gesture that acknowledged what they'd shared, these strange months where enemies had lived as something almost like neighbors. One woman gasped. Another covered her mouth. Kyoko felt her throat tighten. These men who'd been the faceless enemy in propaganda films, who'd been promised as monsters, stood bareheaded in the Texas dawn and offered respect to women they'd been told were the enemy. Yumi whispered, barely audible over the engine, "They eat first tonight." This time everyone understood. That night months ago, when the Cowboys had stepped aside and let prisoners eat before guards, hadn't been charity. It had been recognition, an acknowledgment that even in war some things remained sacred. That hunger was hunger, that exhaustion was exhaustion, that humanity persisted even when empires demanded it be surrendered. The truck rolled past the barracks where they'd slept under clean blankets, past the wash house where months of grime and fear had been scrubbed away, past the garden they'd tended, the fire pit where questions without answers had been asked. Mesquite trees stood silent. Chickens clucked indifferent. The ranch that had been both prison and refuge shrank behind them. No one spoke. Each woman carried her memories, some sharp, others strangely gentle. They didn't know what awaited them in Japan. Shame, perhaps. Silence, likely. A home that no longer felt like home. They were returning to a defeated, occupied country, changed as much as they were. They'd left as believers and were coming back as something more complicated. But they carried something no border could confiscate. They'd seen the enemy's face weathered, sunburned, sometimes kind. They'd been treated as humans. That knowledge outlasted propaganda and empire. Kyoko rested her head against the wooden side of the truck and closed her eyes. The Texas wind was dry, carrying dust and distant rain. She thought of the blanket she'd been allowed to keep, the flower-scented soap, the card games, the harmonica music under foreign stars. Most of all, she remembered the first night in the mess hall, the moment the Cowboys stepped aside and said, "They eat first tonight," not as weakness, as principle. That was the real shock. Not cruelty, but its absence. It broke something in her, an armor of certainty, and in the breaking, something new grew. Not forgiveness for the war, but recognition. The world was more complex than ideology allowed. When she opened her eyes, Texas was fading behind them. Ahead lay the journey home and the harder task of living with what she now knew. Maybe there were no answers. Maybe the best she could do was remember honestly and speak truthfully. Yes, I was afraid. Yes, I was fed. Yes, they treated us like humans. The truck carried them toward ships, toward a rebuilding Japan, toward lives no one could predict. Kyoko wasn't afraid of cruelty anymore, only of forgetting, and she knew she never would. They ate first that night, and quietly, irrevocably, the world shifted.